Hi, coming up next on wood carving, we'll be making this Adirondack Santa. So stick around. Hi, come on in. My name is Rick Butz. Welcome to wood carving. Today we're starting a whole new series, and I have some exciting projects I'd like to show you, like this eagle design from the War of 1812, a clipper ship figurehead, and a block print. We'll also be making a realistic red fox, and an orca and calf, an old-style St. Nicholas, and a couple of my favorites, a black burning warbler and a flying parula warbler. These are really neat birds. Just for fun, we'll be making a fishing frog and an old-style puffin decoy. Today, when you came in, I was working on an Adirondack St. Nicholas. And this is the guy we're making right here. This is based on some legends from the Adirondack Mountains. It's kind of a neat little character. What I was doing when you came in was just roughing this out. And let me show you how I laid this guy out here. I started out by tracing the design from the book on here and cut out the profile first. That way I could lay it flat on the bandsaw table and trace out the silhouette. You can also do this with a coping saw. You can even just carve it out of a solid block of wood. But if you have a bandsaw or a coping saw, it speeds things up a bit. And to rough it out, I fastened in my bench. I was taking a gouge and just knocking off some of the big chunks and rounding off the corners. One of the tools that's really handy for roughing them out at this stage is called the macaroni gouge. And this is a tool that has three sides, formed sort of like a box-like shape. And what's handy is you can use like a big V gouge, and you can work one side, or you can come over and work the other side with it. And it's a very handy tool. Now, I'm not trying to carve the whole thing here, just take away some of the waste wood so it takes a little less time to use the knife. And we're not worried about being particularly neat here either. Just rounding off the shapes. The nice thing about having a vise to work in is you can turn it around and the wood is always locked down steady. And just work down a little bit here. Now you notice when you're going down like this, you can't pry it up like that or you'll split a big chunk off. So I'll usually just work a little bit, make some chips, and then come around from the other direction and cut those clean. And that's a good way to rough it out. I like making these Santa Clauses when we start getting some of the first snows up here, which sometimes come a little earlier than I'd like September, sometimes in October. And it reminds me, well, the holidays are going to be on us sooner than I think, and I like to get working. What you don't want to do is wait until the last minute and try to do these the night before Christmas, because usually you have other people who say, oh, I want one of those too, and you remember different folks that you'd like to give these to as gifts. So I think the moral of the story is it's always good to start early. Now my home is in the Adirondack Mountains, which is in upstate New York. And it's a area, it's actually a state park of about 6 million acres, which is larger than some of the national parks. Because of the harsh climate and the difficulties in traveling through the region, the area really wasn't settled until the mid-1800s and more closer towards the end of the century. The first settlers in the area were lumberjacks, a few hopeful farmers, and the occasional hermit. Even the Native Americans didn't live up here year-round, which shows they had more sense than the rest of us. As people started settling into the villages around the lakes, some of the stories brought from other cultures of the St. Nicholas figures and Santa figures kind of got woven into the local culture. And I think it was maybe from the Norwegian and Swedish lumberjacks, the stories of Tomten, which was a small gnome-like creature that lived in the forests, that was a friend of the animals and took care of the animals in the forest and watched over the farmyard animals. And these stories began and kind of took on their own life. And as it developed was a figure of an Adirondack Santa who would come around to the villages and bring presents and small gifts of fruit, handmade wooden toys to the children. And sometimes he'd be accompanied through the woods with his companion and friend, a large Adirondack black bear. Some of the stories even include, tales about how the bear would pull a sleigh or carry packages in Adirondack pack baskets, sometimes even trees, which is similar to the Russian version of Grandfather Frost and his bear companion. I'm just going to kind of round these corners off and keep working this away. What I'm using here is 2 strokes on the knife. One is called a paring cut, where you take the knife, hold it in your hand, brace your thumb on the block of wood, and then just carefully shave away the chips just by closing your hand. Another cut that's handy is called the levering cut, where you take and brace the thumb of your left hand on the back of the blade and just use it like a fulcrum and just make little levering cuts here. These 2 cuts will do just about this entire carving. And one thing you don't want to do is start trying to, like you're sharpening a carrot or a pencil. You have no control that way. Once the knife leaves the wood, there's nothing to stop it. Another thing you don't want to do is to hold it in your hand and pull that knife towards you like that with the force of your arm. Because once that leaves the wood, again, there's nothing to stop it. Just a couple little safety tips, bear those in mind, and you can do the whole thing. Going to round off the top of his head here. I put a Christmas tree in his pack basket, and these baskets are actually woven out of ash wood splints. And they were something the guides and the hermits used to carry things around. They would hold a fair amount of heavy material, and they're pretty rugged. But that's one thing I like about living where I am, is you can go out and cut your own Christmas trees, and that's kind of fun. Of course, I didn't realize it, but there's a whole culture and mythology of Christmas trees in the Adirondacks, too. The interesting thing is I found that people don't cut the Christmas trees on their own property. You go someplace else to cut your trees. And for a long time, I'd heard people say, where'd you get that nice Christmas tree? Because trees are kind of hard to find. There's a lot of trees in the forest, but they're not very bushy. In the deep forest, they don't get a lot of light, and they're kind of scraggly looking and sort of wimpy. So you like to get something small and bushy, and most people usually cut them off, leaving a lot of stump, so the tree keeps growing. The stump will split into 2 or 3 different sections. So it doesn't really kill the tree. You're just pruning it back a few feet. Anyway, I'd ask people where they got this nice Christmas tree, and they say, well, I got it at Grandpa's. And that's interesting. But everyone kept getting their trees at Grandpa's or Grandma's. And finally I said, well, wait a minute. who is this person? They said, oh, well, we don't know. I go, you don't know? They said, well, no. Now they go and find a likely looking tree, and they figure that whoever lived there was somebody's grandpa or grandma. So they got the tree at Grandpa's. Sometimes people get permission, too, when they go to looking for a tree. We had someone that came up to our house years ago, young kid, asked me if he had permission, if it's okay to go cut a tree in the woods in back of us. And I said, well, it's not my land. I don't really have any say about it. I mean, it's okay with me. And he said, oh, great, thanks. So he figured he'd had permission. And, of course, I like to get permission, too, if I'm going over somebody else's woods to cut a tree. They always look better in somebody else's property, you know. And if someone's got 40 acres of trees, you figure, hey, they're not going to miss a little scrubby tree. Well, my neighbor gave me permission. He said, oh, yeah, anytime, just go ahead and cut one. So I've been getting my trees over in his wood lot for many years now. The interesting thing is, unfortunately, he passed away about 10 years ago. But I figured, hey, I still got permission. I was reading in the Farmer's Almanac that the Christmas tree business actually started in Albany, New York. Really, it's true. According to their story, this happened sometime towards the end of the last century. I don't remember the dates right off, or I don't remember the person's name either. But apparently, this guy had seen all the trees in the forest in the area around here, and thought it'd be kind of nice to take a bunch of trees into New York City and see if he could sell them to a lot of the German immigrants that were there, because Christmas trees were part of their tradition. And so he cut a whole bunch of trees and bundled them up, put them on his wagon, and had his horses carry them into the city, and sold them all. He did this a couple times, and turned out they had a kind of a profitable little business going there. Other people got the idea, so that's how the Christmas tree industry started in America, traced back to this guy. Well, I'm just kind of having fun here, rounding off these corners and working around here. It's kind of interesting when you start out with a big clunky piece of wood. It doesn't look like much, and you keep working at it and just keep taking off shavings, and eventually you hit a point where it all sort of comes together and you say, wow, I can see what I'm working on here. Well, anyway, just kind of keep working along here, round off the corners and work out these general shapes. It'll take you a little while longer yet, but eventually you're going to come up with a carving that looks a little bit like this guy. And what I've done is just continued on what we were doing and shaped around the hands a little bit better. For his hat, there's two ways you can do this. You can take and make a series of notches around there and just keep working around like that, taking off small notches and work it around there. Another thing you can do is you can use our macaroni tool that we started out with earlier, and you can make it incise a line like we did with the cuffs, or like we're doing for the cuffs here. Exactly the same type of cut. Now when you're using this technique, there's two things you can do. You can brace your thumb on the wood and then just move this with a very short little cuts, kind of like the paring cut with a knife. You don't want to hold it in this hand and then scoot it over like that. That, again, if your hand isn't braced here, once that leaves the wood, there's nothing to stop it. Okay? A very important safety thing. You can also take it and hold it like a pencil. But again, my fingers are always braced on the wood. That is the numero uno rule. Always keep the hands holding the tool braced on the wood for control and safety. I always keep my fingers from the other side, my other hand, out of the line of fire too, just for safety. So we can incise a line around there, and then for the top part of the cuff, we can just come and make another cut above that. You can also do this to make the hat. And then just take your knife and carefully pare away the wood on either side of that, and that makes the cuff up here raised. And that's how we carve the shoe. You can do the same thing for making the sleeve around his hand here. You can just take and size a line around that. And again, you can also just take and notch that with your knife too, using the paring cut and the levering cut, and just shape his hand. The thing to remember about doing hands is always shape the the general shapes, like make the shape of the fist first. Well, kind of like on this side over here. We've got a sort of a clunky shape there. Don't worry about the fingers yet. Make the shape of the hand first, the shape of the fist. And you can even take and hold your own fist in the same position and take a look at it and see how it looks, and that'll serve you as a guide. And then detail it. Easiest way is to take a small V-tool. And this is one that's only 3 millimeters wide and is shaped like a tiny V. And just use that to size where his thumb is going to be. I'm holding it like the pencil now. And size a line for each finger, or for each space. 3 spaces give you 4 fingers. I always have to stop and count. And then take our knife and trim up the excess wood. And that will create the hand. Then what we do later is just drill a little hole into the bottom of his hand here, insert a little branch, and that'll give him a walking stick. And that's basically how you do the body of the Santa. What gives people a lot of confusion is carving the faces. And it's not that hard to do, you just want to approach it in kind of a step-by-step procedure. I begin by rounding out the shapes below the hat, and then I take and I draw a line, maybe about 1/8 or about 1/4 of an inch, or 2/8. 2/8 of an inch is 1/4 of an inch. 1/4 of an inch down, and then another line below that, about 1/4 of an inch for the bottom of his nose, and then I sketch in his beard. I just kind of sketch in about where the beard line is going to be, and then take a V-gouge. Now, V-gouge is a little handier to get in here than with a knife. You can do it with just a knife, but if you have one that will incise the wood like this, it makes it easier. And we'll come around and do the other side here. Remember, always keep your fingers, when you're doing this, braced on the wood for safety and control. Very important. And for your peace of mind, too. You also get much more precision with your cuts when your hands holding the tool are braced on the wood like that. And that's one of the secrets to getting these nice little details. Okay, now I've outlined his beard. I'm just going to trim down the sides a little bit. And now we can start working on the face. The place I like to begin is by making a notch where the eye line is, where the eyes would be here. And I make a notch for that. And then the line we drew for the bottom of the nose, I make another notch there. Don't try to make this all with just one cut. Do it with a series of smaller cuts. And bring that down, maybe 1/8 of an inch or so. Now what we're doing is creating the profile. And if you take your carving and look at it from the side, you notice that with the eye line notched out here and the nose line notched out, we've got the profile of the carving already. And we've already established what the face is going to be like. You can adjust the shape of his nose by, if you want a sort of a turn-up nose, you can adjust it at this point. If you want him to have sort of a long nose, you can angle it down. You can create all sorts of varieties here. Now the next step, I like to go to a knife with a little finer point for doing the detailing. And what we do, we hold the knife in a pencil grip. And this is again holding it like a pencil. And I have my fingers braced against the blade. I'm taking a small line down the side of his nose. Another line down the other side of his nose. Then, using our levering cut, I just carve out the wood on either side. And this forms the cheeks. And we can do even a little more shaping on the cheeks if we want. And take a couple tiny cuts off the nose to round it. For doing the eyes, we've got our line here that we made. We can take and make a line inside a sort of half moon shape below that line and one above that line. And I'm using the pencil grip again. These aren't very deep cuts. They're fairly shallow. You're only talking maybe a 32nd of an inch or less. And then using our levering cut, come through and slice out a tiny little shaving above and below that. Use a paring cut for this side. This is where this nice pointed little blade comes in, but it has to be sharp right to the very tip. And that creates the shape of the eye. This is a folk carving style. This is one that was developed in Germany. I learned it through my family. And they used pine up in that alpine region. And the work was done primarily with just a knife and a few simple tools. And it's a nice, simple little style that creates a very expressive face. If you want to do a mustache on the guy, we can take and size a line around to wherever. Make another one. And then, just like we did with the eyes, take and pare away a tiny little slice below that. And that gives us our mustache. To texture the beard, just take your little V-tool that you had and make a series of cuts through there. And that will give you the texture. Just little cuts, nothing real big. Don't take off too much wood, just enough to give a little bit of a texture there. And that's all there is to it. It's like magic watching these little faces just appear out of a block of wood. It is so neat. But the secret is take your time and make sure your tools are extra sharp. Now for making this pack basket, just take a little piece of wood, whittle it around, and then again take a V-gouge in the pencil grip, just make a series of short little choppy lines through there. And then alternate those in another row going down, and alternate those with another row going down, and that sort of simulates that basket weave effect. And that's kind of like what we've done over here. And that creates the illusion of the basket. For the Christmas tree, I just took a scrap of pine, whittled it into shape, and then glued it in place. For the snowshoes, I took another thin piece of pine and cut it the right shape and glued it in. For the texturing, I used a wood burning pen. You can also just use a pen and etch in the lines. For painting, I used alkyd paints, which are similar to oils, and thin those out with turpentine and then just apply that on as a very light stain. That lets the wood grain show through. The white I used acrylics because of they're very opaque. And then for the small details like the holly and the berries, I used enamel paint because it shines a lot better. And that's our Adirondack Santa. Next week, we'll be making his companion, his faithful black bear. It'll be a really neat project. Well, I've had a lot of fun being with you today, and until next time, I'm Rick Butz wishing you happy carving.
Rick Butz has written 2 books entitled Woodcarving Step by Step, Woodland Creatures and Santas. Rick demonstrates and describes through extensive illustrations and photographs how to carve a chipmunk, a river otter, a red fox, an alpine St. Nicholas, an Adirondack Santa and his bear, and a Swiss St. Nicholas. The 2-book collection is available by calling 1-800-950-9648. The price is $29.90 plus shipping and handling.
Hi, coming up next on wood carving, we'll be carving a black bear to go along with the Adirondack Santa Claus we carved last week. So stick around. Hi, come on in. My name is Rick Butz. Welcome to wood carving. Today we're going to be carving a black bear to go along with the Adirondack Santa that we carved last week. And this is what this little guy is going to look like. What I was doing when you came in was I have traced out the pattern to the bear, and then I was cutting out with a coping saw. And one of the things that I need to do is cut out some wood between his feet to make it a little easier to carve. And to do that, I was using this coping saw. And what's neat about those is they have a very thin blade so that you can turn that. And I can actually make a right angle turn through here and hopefully cut out this scrap wood. There we go. Now, one of the things that you want to pay some special attention on with this bear is sketch in where the legs are going to go. And that helps you know how much wood to cut out on each side, so you end up with a right leg and a left leg. If you don't figure it right, you can end up with 2 left legs. So what I've done is just sort of sketch those in, and sometimes I'll even put an X on here to mark off what wood needs to be carved away. Now I can put them in the vise. Make sure it's good and firm. And take a gouge and just carve that out. With that wood cut away in the middle, it acts as a stop cut, so it's not going to go anywhere. And when I have them here, what I'm going to do is also make another stop cut here and round his tummy off just a little bit. That'll save a little bit of carving with a knife when we get to finishing them. And let's see, why don't I take and round off a couple of corners while I'm on this side too. Let's do the other side. I want to be careful not to put too much pressure on this guy. Let's see, maybe I can hold him like this. There we go. And then I can take and carve away the wood here. Now, let's see. Let's round off some more of the wood, and then we'll finish the rest with a knife. We talked a little bit last week about how the legend in the Adirondacks was of a Santa Claus. It's a little different from other places. He's sort of considered like a magical hermit that lived off in the woods. And I thought it was based on some of the stories like of the Tomten from the Swedish Norwegian lumberjacks that used to work in the area. And one of the legends talks about a black bear that would follow Santa around and sometimes pull his sleigh and carry toys through the snow. And that almost sounds very similar to the story of Grandfather Frost, the Russian equivalent of St. Nicholas. And sometimes you'll see carvings that are carved by Russian craftsmen where they'll have a bear pulling a sleigh with a Santa in it. For a while there's a lot of really neat carvings coming out of a small village called Bogorodsk, which was about 70 kilometers from Moscow. And a lot of very nice carvings were being imported for a while. I haven't seen too many lately, but there's a very rich carving tradition over there as well. With the bench and the gouge, you can really remove a lot of excess wood fairly quickly. I think we can do most of the rest with a knife now. Close the vise down, put that away. Then we'll just make ourselves comfortable and do some serious whittling. I'm using the paring cut for doing this, and that's where you hold the knife in your hand, brace your thumb against the end of the block of wood, and then just slowly close your hand and draw the knife through the wood. You don't need to take very big chips. And you always try to keep your thumb out of the line of fire here too. And that's sort of the classic whittler's cut. Christmas is kind of a welcome time in the Adirondacks. Like any mountain area, it gets kind of dull in the winter. So people are always welcome for any kind of a diversion, especially a nice festival. And I think that's what's really neat about the Christmas tradition is it falls on the time historically when the days finally start lengthening again. And it's a time of partying in the northern hemisphere for thousands of years. A friend of mine was telling me about something else people were doing around the holidays to kind of ease cabin fever. This was in the winter. A friend of mine was telling me about a chili cooking contest they're having in a nearby town. And they'd have a bunch of people that have entries for their chili recipes, and then the whole town would turn out and kind of sample it and judge it, and sort of by vote say who they thought had the best chili. And there are several categories: amateur, professional, vegetarian. One of the chili samples that this woman particularly liked, she asked the guy what he used to soak his beans in. And he said, well, somebody borrowed his wheelbarrow, so he was soaking them in his canoe this year. But he said, don't worry, it's a new canoe. And my friend thought this was, this is pretty crazy. You know, the guy's having fun with the Flatlanders. So later that evening, she met his wife and said, "Oh, what's Joe using to soak his chili beans in this year?" She says, "I don't know. It's a big secret, but he's been spending a lot of time in the boathouse the past 2 weeks." So I don't know. Believe what you will. His chili, by the way, did win a prize. The moral of the story, my friend said, was that every cook has their secret ingredient. And she thinks this guy's secret ingredient is birch bark flavor. Bears are kind of neat. I like bears. They're kind of, well, if you don't mess with them, they kind of leave you alone. They just sort of go about their business, big clunky old animals. Kind of nice. But they can be a little bit intimidating if you get very close to them. And a friend of mine had a close encounter the other spring. She was expecting company and heard some noise on the porch and thought it was her guests. So she flung open the door, and there was this bear goes, "Ah!" And she goes, "Ah!" And everybody ran separate ways. And that was how she was keeping from being bored that evening. I'm just going along here and rounding off the corners on the bear. Now, one thing I want to show you here is as I was carving, I noticed a knife start to dig in. Now, what's happening is if you look at it from the side here, you see it goes downhill. The wood grain goes more or less parallel in this direction. And so if you start to try and go uphill with this, you notice how it starts to dig in? Now, if I start pushing any pressure on that, that'll cause that wood to split out in a big chunk. So what I'm saying is this is called carving against the grain. Whenever you carve and you feel it would start to splinter or tear, you just turn around and carve it from the opposite direction. And then you get nice clean shavings coming out. Now in a place like this where you've got a valley, you have to work from one side and get down the valley and work from the other. A lot of people talk about the mystery of carving with a grain. It's not really a mystery. You just need to sort of develop a little sensitivity to it. It's a lot like petting a dog or a cat. You know, one way feels right and the other way doesn't. And the dog or cat will tell you which way is right. And likewise, the wood will tell you which way is right. So we just keep working around here. This is a nice project. You can sort of just sit by the fire and watch this little guy take shape out of a block of wood. I think that's one of the neat things about wood carving. It's almost like magic. You take a piece of wood and you just take a little wood away here and a little away there, and pretty soon you have an animal looking back at you, or a figure, or whatever. And no matter how many times I carve a piece of wood, you still get the same sense of excitement of watching something come to life right in front of you. I think that's why little carvings like this are so appropriate for Christmas. Because it's kind of a magical time, especially when you're young. I suppose it gets a little less magical when you realize you have to shovel snow. But even then, sometimes you can kind of forget about the snow and just relax and sit by the fire and have a good time. So all throughout the legends, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, Christmas is always historically a time of magic and of hope and peace and goodwill. Just keep carving along this guy. I really think that the lumberjacks had a lot to do with the creation of this story. So they had a hard life, and they worked hard, and in the evenings they'd sit around the bunkhouse, and that was their entertainment, to tell stories about things that had happened and people they'd known, and sort of recount events. Like the legends of Paul Bunyan. You know, came out of the Minnesota lumberjacks, legends and stories. And I think the Adirondack St. Nicholas and his bear, stories from the lumberjacks. Of course, some of the stories are a little crazy too. And I don't know if this is exactly a Christmas story, but I'll tell you anyway. And this is one I heard many years ago. Supposedly, it was from a distant relative called Maurice Callahan, who one season was working as a lumberjack. And this would be sometime, as I hear the story, sometime around the early 1930s. Well, most of the lumber camps, they had a cook, because these guys had voracious appetites and they'd eat just tons of food. And some of the big lumber camps that have a full-time cook, maybe even 2 or 3 cooks, and they start cooking well before dawn, and then the lumberjacks would come in and they would feed them this huge breakfast, and they'd go out and work. In the meantime, they'd start cooking up lunch, and they'd cook up a huge dinner. So they were cooking all the time. Well, this lumber camp that Maurice was assigned to was so small that they didn't have a cook. So the lumberjacks would take turns cooking, and it was done on a volunteer basis, which seems fair enough. And the way you volunteered was, the first person who complained about the cooking was the new cook. I suppose that only sounds reasonable. But they didn't tell Maurice. So he comes into the lumber camp, sits down, has supper with him, and it wasn't very good. And he said to the guy next to him, kind of discreetly, he said, "Is the food here always this bad?" And bang, just like that, there's the cook standing behind him, hands him the apron and says, "Well, if you think you can do any better, you're the cook." So that's how Maurice got to be the cook at Lumber Camp 17. Now, he didn't like that very well. You know, cooking, that was not man's work. He came to go out and work out in the woods. So he thought, well, this isn't going to last long, because he wasn't a very good cook to begin with, and he got worse. So sometimes the food was burned. Sometimes he put too much salt in it. Sometimes he put too much pepper in it. Nobody said anything. After about 2 weeks, this was getting on his nerves. He didn't want to be slaving over a stove. He wanted to be out working in the woods. Well, as I hear the story, one afternoon he's out walking behind the cook shed and happens to see this moose patty laying there in the ground, sort of baking in the sun. Now, for some of you who've grown up on farms, you know what I'm talking about here. We used, in the Midwest, used to call them buffalo chips or cow pies. Well, anyway, this one had been drying to almost hard as a piece of wood. So he gets this idea. And he takes a couple of sticks and he flips this thing up and he rolls down into the cook shack. And he makes this real nice fancy pie crust. And he flips this moose patty up into the pie crust, puts another real fancy crust on top of that, and pops it in the oven. Well, that night, supper came around, and had a pretty decent supper for the guys. And then he thought, it's time to bring on dessert. And he was just waiting by the kitchen with his ear to the wall, just waiting for the first person to complain so he could say, "Well, you think you can do any better? Well, then you're the cook." And he waited. And the minutes ticked by, and all he could hear was the clink of the silverware on the platters. And nobody said anything. And he was getting really freaked out. Then finally, some big lumberjack stands up, slams down his fork, and he says, "Good grief! This is moose patty pie!" But it's good. So anyway, they had a lot of these crazy stories, and that's what they do for entertainment. It's all kind of part of the mountain oral tradition that seems to go every place where you have people looking for some source of entertainment. Well, this is a nice little project here. I'm just kind of having fun sitting here whittling along. Let's see. We have gotten down to rounding his neck off. And I'm going to narrow that down just a little bit. And I'm going to carve a collar for him. And it's not really a collar, it's more of a decorative ribbon. Okay, it's just something fancy. And the way to do that is round that off. Then you can take a V-tool and you can draw the lines first, or if you're feeling bold, you just go ahead and hope for the best. Now I'm using a pencil grip here. I'm holding this tool. This is a V-tool, which is shaped like two sides that come together to form a V. And I'm holding that like a pencil and very gently pushing it through the wood with my fingers braced firmly against the wood, making small little cuts. And I kind of keep my other hand out of the line of fire. And then we can make another line around here for the other side of his ribbon, collar, decoration. And let's see, we need to shape his muzzle just a little more. For doing the eyes, we can take another V-tool, a tiny one, or you can just paint him in. What I did on this guy was I took and carved a little tiny circle, using the pencil grip again. Carve a little round spot there. Then take the point of your knife and just very carefully pare that wood away. Let's round off his muzzle a little more here too. The secret to doing his carvings, especially in a soft wood like pine that we're using here, is you want to have your knife very sharp. It has to be razor sharp. We'll talk a little more about that later. Do his mouth, we just take our V-tool and let's see, I'm going to pencil this in first. I usually just wing it, but I like to have a happy expression. And we'll incise a little line for his mouth. And that's the basic idea for our black bear. Now for his packages, what we can do is, I've taken and rounded this piece off a little bit. And this is kind of fun because you can actually take a round piece of wood and make it square. And you just do a little carving here. Just little cuts at a time. Don't try to be heroic. There's an old woodcarver saying 3 small cuts are better than 1 big one. So don't ever forget that. So anyway, you get the idea. Now for painting this guy. What I like to do first is to paint his collar. And to do that, I use enamel paints. I also like the packages and the ribbons and things. I use enamel on because it's a little more durable and has a little more shine and body to it. And I'm going to use red for the ribbon here. And see, that's a nice thick paint. Dries fairly quickly. It has a lot of body, so it dries with a nice shine to it. For the rest of the body, we can stain it with some oil paints thinned in turpentine. And you just take, I use a little ivory black and a little burnt umber just to warm it up, and then thin it out and put that on kind of as a stain. The muzzle on the black bear is generally a little lighter color than the rest of the body, so when you come around to the front here, just paint his beak and then just kind of fudge it in there. Or you can paint a little yellow ochre in there as well. And that's how we paint them. A lot of fun. Very nice, straightforward, fun project. To put his packages on, just take and glue them onto the side. You can texture them too by taking a little bit of a small V-tool and making a little row of cuts in that. This is like we did with our Santa last week. And that simulates the woven ash splint that the baskets are made out of. And then just glue them onto the bear, and that's what you end up with. Isn't that neat? So now, our Adirondack Santa has a black bear for a companion. This is a fun project. Try it. I think you'll really enjoy it. Next week, we're going to do something a little different. We'll be making this clipper ship figurehead. And it's use a little bit of different technique, and I'll show you some kind of neat ways to antique it as well. Well, I've had a lot of fun being with you today, and until next time, I'm Rick Butz wishing you happy carving.
Rick Butz has written 2 books entitled Woodcarving Step by Step, Woodland Creatures and Santas. Rick demonstrates and describes through extensive illustrations and photographs how to carve a chipmunk, a river otter, a red fox, an alpine St. Nicholas, an Adirondack Santa and his bear, and a Swiss St. Nicholas. The 2-book collection is available by calling 1-800-950-9648. The price is $29.90 plus shipping and handling.